Hello everybody and welcome to Books with Ike. My name is Isaac and today I'm going to be going over every single book I read in 2019. So I have 31 books to talk about, so I'm just going to get on into it. The first book I read in 2019 was Queen of Air and Darkness by Cassandra Clare. This is the third and final book in the Dark Artifices trilogy, which is part of her overall Shadowhunter Chronicles. The Dark Artifices is set 5 years after the end of the Mortal Instruments series, and it follows Emma Carstairs as she tries to solve the mysterious deaths of her parents from 5 years ago. The Dark Artifices is probably my favourite Shadowhunter series. I think the plot and the characters are a lot more sophisticated than any of her other work, and the first two books are just leagues above anything else she's written. So I was kind of disappointed by this book. I originally gave it 5 stars, but I dropped that down to 4 later because while the back half of the book does contain some of my favourite scenes from the entire Shadowhunter Chronicles, the first 150 pages or so were really difficult to get through. I was very bored reading them, and it didn't feel like the characters were reacting appropriately to the situation that was left at the end of the previous book. So I was quite let down by that. I think it's probably my least favourite of all of Cassandra Clare's finales, which is a bit of a shame. But I did still enjoy it, and I am still looking forward to the next series, The Wicked Powers. The next book I read in 2019 was The Burning Maze by Rick Riordan, or however it's pronounced. So, this is the third book in his Trials of Apollo series, which is part of the overall Percy Jackson universe. The Trials of Apollo follows the god Apollo as he is stripped of his powers and banished to Earth by Zeus after the events of the Heroes of Olympus series, and he has to prove himself worthy of becoming a god again. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I thought it had some really great development for Apollo especially. There are also some quite big emotional gut punches in this book, and if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. I think so far this is probably my favourite of the Trials of Apollo series. The next book I read was Black Wings Beating by Alex London. This is the first in a YA high fantasy trilogy called Skybound, and this is set in a world where everything revolves around birds of prey. So everything to do with religion, sports, society, everything revolves around birds. And the main way of life in this society is falconry. This follows a pair of twins called Bryson and Kylie who have to go into the mountains and capture a ghost eagle, which is the most deadly and feared bird of prey in existence, and one of them killed their father. Meanwhile, there is an army of religious fanatics who believe that the capture and training of birds is blasphemous, who are rampaging around the country and killing falconers. I enjoyed this book. I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I thought the main characters and the world building were incredible, just really well done. But there was this one character called Niall, who I just didn't understand at all. He was written so inconsistently, it was really distracting. There was also a part in the middle of the book which I felt was very contrived, and I don't think Bryson had any chemistry with who I presume is going to be his love interest for the rest of the series. So that's why it's a 3.5 stars. But other than that, I did really enjoy it, and I am looking forward to the rest of the series. This book is own voices for gay representation, but it also seems like Kylie might be aromantic. It's not 100% confirmed, but I feel like that's where he's going with it, which isn't something I've read about often, so that's quite interesting. I will say that there are some fairly horrific scenes of child abuse in this book, so I would be aware of that before you go into it. I have written a full review for this book, which I will leave linked in the description. After that, I read Fence Volume 1 by C.S. Pacat, Joanna the Mad, and Joanna Lafuente. This is a graphic novel about a guy called Nicholas Cox, who is the illegitimate son of a fencing champion, and he also wants to be a pro fencer and get the chance to face his legitimate half-brother in a tournament. So he signs up for a prestigious fencing school, and it turns out his roommate is a prodigy fencer called Seiji Katayama, who he has faced before and really hates. So I thought this was decent. I gave it 3 stars, and I will continue with the series. I think the characters are fun and interesting, but there's not really much depth to them yet, and the plot itself is also kind of basic. But I did really enjoy the art, and it also manages to teach you some things about fencing, so that's pretty cool. I've also written a short review for this book, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. The next book I read in 2019 is Firestarter by Tara Sim. This is the third and final book in the Timekeeper trilogy, which is set in a sort of steampunk Victorian London where time is controlled by magic clock towers, and when the clock towers break, time itself also breaks. So there is an order of people who can see and repair time, and they are the clock mechanics, and it's their job to maintain the clock towers and keep time running smoothly. The main character is a young clock mechanic called Danny, whose dad is trapped in a town where time has stopped, and he wants to be assigned to the project to build a new clock tower to free the stopped town, which has never been attempted before. But unfortunately, he is suffering from PTSD after an accident, so the lead mechanic is unwilling to give him any serious responsibilities. So he is assigned to the clock tower in Enfield, where he falls in love with a time spirit, which is illegal. Meanwhile, there are terrorists who are bombing the clock towers and stopping time. So I love this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I thought the character development and the plot were just excellent. The series really escalates as it goes along, and this is a brilliant climax. I did have a slight problem with the ending. Not the ending itself, but just how we got to it. Which, if you've read this book, you probably know what I mean, but maybe it's just me, I don't know. I will say that while the first book is a very cute and fluffy gay romance, the other 2 books are quite dark, and this one in particular does contain a torture scene, so I would bear that in mind. But yeah, Timekeeper is one of my favourite series of all time, and I highly recommend it. The next book I read in 2019 is Saga Volume 1 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. So this is a sort of Romeo and Juliet story about 2 members of warring races called Marco and Alana who fall in love and have a kid, and everyone else wants them dead. I enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed the main characters, Marco and Alana, mostly because they're kind of the only good people in the book. Like, everyone else ranges from minorly unscrupulous to total bastard. So, yeah. The character and world design is also excellent. The art is just absolutely incredible. It's some of my favourite graphic novel art I've ever seen. But I did have some problems with it, namely that there are a lot of unanswered questions about the world building, which I thought were kind of important to know. And also, this story is narrated by their daughter, and that is a pretty explicit confirmation that their daughter survives the story, and I don't want to know that. So I didn't like that aspect of it either. But other than that, it was really great, and I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already. I have written a full review for this, so I'll leave it linked in the description. Next I read What If It's Us by Becky Albertalli and Adam Silvera. So this is about 2 boys who meet in a post office, and there's like an instant spark of attraction between them, but they don't exchange numbers or any other contact details, so the book is basically about them finding each other again. I've only read 1 book from each of these authors individually: Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli, and History Is All You Left Me by Adam Silvera. And I gave both of those books 5 stars, and they're some of my favourite books ever. So I was really disappointed by this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I thought it was just a really typical contemporary romance with really nothing special about it. The whole story is like completely bland and forgettable. I barely even remember the characters' names. I think it's Ben and Arthur. So yeah, I was really disappointed by this. Then I read The Diviners by Libba Bray. So this is a Prohibition-era supernatural horror story about a girl called Evie O'Neill, who is sent to stay with her uncle in New York after a scandal in her home state of Ohio. And in New York, a serial killer is just beginning his work, and Evie has a strange power that might be the key to stopping him. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. I thought the characters and the plot were really well done, but I'd say the story's greatest strength is the atmosphere, because it's really creepy and eerie and foreboding, and it's really well done. My main problem with the book is probably the romance between Evie and her love interest, because it feels like they go from just starting to be friends to wanting each other intimately in like no time at all, and I really didn't like their relationship. But I did think the other romance in here was really good, so it balances out. I really enjoyed this and I can't wait to get to the rest of the series. The next book I read is The Red Scrolls of Magic by Cassandra Clare and Wesley Chu. So this is the first book in a new series of the Shadowhunter Chronicles called The Eldest Curses, which follows Magnus and Alec. This particular book is set in between the two halves of the Mortal Instruments series, and it follows Alec and Magnus as their holiday in Paris is interrupted by the fact that when he was younger, Magnus started a cult. And now that cult is doing terrible things, and they have to track down the leader and stop them. Otherwise, Magnus is going to be punished for it. I'd say this book's main strength is that it, seamlessly slots into the gap in the series where it takes place. The writing style is very reminiscent of the Mortal Instruments series, and the characters are written exactly as they were at that point in the story, with all the same problems and issues with their relationship. So I think it really adds a lot to the original series. But unfortunately you can't read it in its chronological placement because there are some massive spoilers for the end of the series. So that's a bit of a disappointment. But I would be interested in a chronological reread of the series. So yeah, I loved this book, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and I can't wait for the next one. This hardback is probably one of my favourites that I own because I really love the contrast of the blue and the red. I think they go really well together. Switching gears almost completely, after that I read A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. So yes, this was my first time reading the series, and no, I had not seen the show when I started. But I got into A Song of Ice and Fire for very unconventional reasons, I think. Because I already knew, all of the spoilers going in. So nothing in this series really surprised me, but I still loved it. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I love the characters, I love the world building, I even love the writing style. Lots of people say that his writing style is quite dry, and I don't see that at all. I think his writing style is brilliant. It was reading the prologue that convinced me that I should read the series, even after I'd put it off so long because I thought it would never get finished, and I didn't want to be one of the people who were disappointed by the fact that the series was never gonna be over. But apparently I am now going to be one of those people. My favourite of the POV characters from the start is John, and he remains one of my favourite characters. If somehow you don't know what this is about, it's about a bunch of families fighting to be the rulers of the Kingdom of Westeros, while a horde of ice zombies threatens to make all of their petty human squabbles irrelevant by means of icy death. After A Game of Thrones, I read A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. This is obviously the sequel to A Game of Thrones, and I also gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I can't really talk too much about this because obviously it is a sequel, but I will say that it introduces 2 new POV characters who are also some of my favourites in the series. So my dad owned the first 3 books. I own them now because I've stolen them from him. But after reading this one, I went out and bought the rest of the series just immediately, as well as A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which I haven't read yet. After that, I read Rivers of London by Ben Aronovich, if that's how you even pronounce his name. You might know this book by its US title, Midnight Riot. And I read this book because my brother recommended it to me. This is an adult urban fantasy about a cop called Peter Grant, who is investigating a murder, and he is given an eyewitness account of the murder by a ghost. And after that, he becomes apprenticed to Detective Chief Inspector Thomas Nightingale, the last remaining wizard in England. I liked this book. I thought I was going to give it 4 stars for the first, 3/4 of the book, but the plot is resolved in a way that is just not foreshadowed or set up at all. And while I liked the characters, they weren't really given any depth in this book, and so I'm not very invested in them, and I have no interest in continuing the series. I have written a review for this, and I will leave a link for it in the description, but it essentially says the exact same things. Then I read Bedlam by Derek Landy. This is the latest book in the Skullduggery Pleasant series. It's either the 12th or the 13th, depending on whether you count Tanith Low and the Maleficent 7. So, Skullduggery Pleasant is a middle grade urban fantasy series about a 12-year-old girl called Stephanie Edgley, who becomes the apprentice of a magical detective who just so happens to be a reanimated skeleton. And the series follows Stephanie as she grows up, and in this latest book she is 25, I think, and dealing with a lot of issues because of previous books. But it is my favourite series of all time. There is absolutely no competition. So yeah, I loved this book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. This book is crazy. So much happens in it, I couldn't even accurately summarise it if I tried. It's really creepy, it's really sad, it's also hilarious. These are the only books which have ever made me laugh out loud. This series was probably the first book series that actually made me cry, and I don't really often cry at books, so that's an achievement in and of itself. I've even marked like 2 scenes just because they were so hilarious I had to read them out to my family. So yeah, this series is incredible, and if you're sleeping on it, just stop. You need to read it. Just go on. I'm telling you, read Skullduggery Pleasant. You will not be disappointed. And also, this book, and all of my Skullduggery Pleasant books, is signed. These are the only books I have ever got signed, and this one in particular is signed twice, because I bought the signed first edition from Waterstones, and then I got it signed in person. After that, I read A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. Obviously, this is the 3rd book in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. This is probably my favourite book in the series. This has some of my favourite scenes in the series, as well as some of my favourite character development, and if you know the story in any way, you probably know what I mean by that. It's at this point that I will say that the Game of Thrones TV show does the books absolutely no justice. So if you've only seen the show, please read the books, they are so much better. So after that, I decided to start reading Doctor Who books, starting with The Eye of the Giant by Christopher Bewlis. The reason I started with this book is that it is chronologically the first in the 3rd Doctor books. Because I started watching the classic series with the 3rd Doctor, and I'm currently in the middle of Peter Davison's era, who is the 5th Doctor. So I haven't gone back and watched the first 2 Doctors yet, so I decided to just start the books here. I will say that it's exactly what I wanted from a Doctor Who book. It feels exactly like 70s era Doctor Who. The characters have exactly the same voices. You can even tell where the end of an episode is supposed to be, so it was good in that respect, but the plot itself was kind of basic, and the way it ended was really weird, and I didn't like it that much, so I ended up giving this 3 stars. I do have a full review for this if you're interested in my more in-depth thoughts, so I'll leave a link for that in the description. Then I read A Feast for Crows by George R.R. Martin, and it's at this point that I started alternating between reading a Song of Ice and Fire book and reading a Doctor Who book. So this is probably my least favourite book in A Song of Ice and Fire, but I did still give it 5 stars. I didn't think I was going to at first, because the beginning was quite hard to get through, but I ended up loving this just as much as the other book, so I gave it 5 stars. There is so much packed into this book which is just not in the show at all. So again, if you've only watched the show, read the books, they're better. After that, I obviously read another Doctor Who book, and this time it was The Scales of Injustice by Gary Russell. This is probably my favourite Doctor Who book that I've read so far. What it's about is really complicated and difficult to summarise, but I'll try my best. So, a boy goes missing from an English village. The policewoman who is sent to find him starts drawing in the style of cave paintings, and the Doctor suspects Silurian involvement. Meanwhile, there is a whistleblower who is attempting to expose the unethical experiments of Department C-19 of the British government. So, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. My experience with this book was really weird, because it was immediately soured, because the introduction to this particular version of the book, this modern reprint, spoils a plot twist of the book, because the introduction was presumably written years after the book itself, so that was really annoying. I also found the beginning quite difficult to get into. I thought it was really badly written. The formatting of this book is really weird and I don't understand why it's formatted the way it is. And the characters don't feel exactly like themselves. Given that I just listed a bunch of problems with it, you're probably wondering why it's my favourite Doctor Who book so far. And it's because this book is a thriller, and once it gets going, it just doesn't stop. It is really fast-paced, it's gory and violent and mysterious and just insane. So it's really fun to read. And also, it really goes deep into the personal lives of the Brigadier and Liz Shaw, and gives them a lot of development that the show didn't. Especially for Liz Shaw, she was written out after one season. She didn't even get an exit story. This is her exit story, and it's great. She gets loads to do. She is so well developed. Just, if you want more Liz Shaw, read this book, because it is just exactly what you want, I promise. Also, the Brigadier's personal life is dived into, and that's really good as well. It was just great at doing what the show couldn't have done and fleshing out these characters more, while also being an incredibly entertaining story. Oh, and I forgot to talk about the villain. The villain is amazing. He is just so creepy and he's always there. You don't understand who he is. It's just great. So yeah, I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. And after that, I read A Dance with Dragons Part 1, Dreams and Dust by George R.R. Martin. Again, I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. The plot development was incredible, the character development was incredible. Talking about these books for me is kind of like beating a dead horse, because I just have the same things to say over and over again. I'd say this book and the second part of A Dance with Dragons probably compete with A Storm of Swords for my favourite book in the series. Tyrion's chapters, especially in this book, are just my favourite in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, I think. After that, I read Doctor Who, The Devil Goblins from Neptune by Keith Topping and Martin Day. So this book is about the Doctor and Liz investigating strange lights in the sky that hippies saw at one of their concerts. And meanwhile, the Brigadier has to investigate corruption at UNIT. So I thought I was going to give this book 5 stars, and I ended up giving it 3, because the first 6 parts of this book are incredible. There is so much in them. The writing is incredible, the story is really fast-paced and interesting, and there are these little interludes throughout which give you snapshots of things going on elsewhere. And the Brigadier's story goes deep into his PTSD, so that was great as well. But the finale doesn't deliver on anything. The answer to the mystery of who is in charge of the corruption at UNIT is the most boring answer possible. The aliens end up being just boring, and the way they are defeated is just the most not Doctor Who thing ever. So yeah, I ended up being really disappointed by this. I have written a full review for this book, which goes a lot more in depth into my thoughts, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. And after that, I obviously read A Dance with Dragons Part 2, After the Feast by George R.R. Martin. And as always, I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was incredible. But unfortunately, this is the last book in the main series so far. And the fact that some people have been left on this massive cliffhanger for, I think it's 11 years, is really terrible. I hope George R.R. Martin actually finishes the series, and I hope The Winds of Winter comes out soon, because I need it. Having finished A Song of Ice and Fire, the next book I read was The Tyrants 2 by Rick Riordan. This is the 4th book in his Trials of Apollo series, and it is the only Percy Jackson universe book to actually get a decent cover in the UK. Seriously, the UK covers for these books are terrible. So I love this book, I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I think that might be a bit generous though. I'd maybe drop it down to 4.5 or even 4. I can't really decide, I'd have to reread it. After that, I read Ghosts of the Shadow Market by Cassandra Clare, Sarah Rees Brennan, Maureen Johnson, Kelly Link, and Robin Wasserman. This is another part of the Shadowhunter Chronicles. This follows a character called Brother Zachariah, who is a significant character in probably all of the Shadowhunter Chronicles so far. And it's basically about his experiences with the Shadow Markets, which are these magical markets which are run by Downworlders, who are the magical creatures of this world. I think this is probably my favourite short story collection overall from this series, but it doesn't contain my favourite individual stories. But yeah, I thought this was a very strong collection. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I'd say my favourite story in this is probably The Land I Lost, but I gave the majority of the stories in here 5 stars, a couple of them 4 stars, and 2 of them 3 stars. I think this adds a lot to the Shadowhunter Chronicles. It introduces some characters that we'll get to know in future books. I'd say one of the romances in here is done better than it is in the main series. I will say that this collection properly introduces a character who was in Queen of Air and Darkness, and in this book you get to see into his head a bit, and I think he's probably one of the worst characters I've ever read about. I don't understand why she decided to create this character. He's so boring. His name is Janus, and he's like every edgy 13-year-old boy's first OC, and I really didn't like reading from his perspective, and I really hope that he doesn't have that significant a role in the Wicked Powers, because that will really bring down the story for me. But other than that detail, I thought this was an incredibly strong collection, and I really enjoyed it. Next, I read Wayward Son by Rainbow Rowell, and this is the sequel to Carry On. And if you didn't know what Carry On is about, it's about a boy called Simon Snow, who is the worst chosen one ever, and he is destined to defeat this magical creature called the Insidious Humdrum, which drains magic from the world. And he has to solve the mystery of the ghost in his room with the help of his arch nemesis and roommate, Tyrannus Basilton Grim Pitch, or Baz, who he thinks is a vampire. It is a deconstruction of Chosen One tropes, of loads of typical fantasy tropes, and it's also just a really sweet romance. This book is none of those things. This book is a fun road trip across America. The romance in this book is terrible. Simon treats Baz like shit. There's possessiveness and jealousy, and it doesn't make sense, and the few sweet moments barely last at all, and the plot itself is entirely filler. The characters are written like idiots, especially the supposedly smart one doesn't know that it will take days to cross America, because apparently British people don't know that. Yeah, I don't recommend this book at all. I gave it 3 stars, but I think that's too generous, so I'd probably drop it down to 2. Honestly, I really recommend reading Carry On. It's one of my favourite books, and it works perfectly as a standalone, and you don't need to read this at all. Before I get into the next book I want to talk about, I will say that I'm having to film this on a different day due to technical difficulties, so if the angle or focus or anything in the background has changed, that's why. And I also have a bit of a cold, so if my voice sounds a bit weird, that's why. So anyway, the next book I read in 2019 was Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, and you may know this by its American title, The Golden Compass. This is the first book in the His Dark Materials trilogy. So this is set in a world where the human soul is personified outside of their body in the form of an animal called a demon. So this is about a girl called Lyra Belacqua, whose uncle comes to the college where she lives with evidence of parallel worlds, and he is seeking funding to investigate this further. Meanwhile, there are a group of people who are abducting children for sinister purposes, and Lyra's best friend gets abducted, and so she has to sort of work out what's happening and try and find him again. So I enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't have the emotional connection to the story that I wanted, because I never read this as a kid, so I didn't like grow up with Lyra or anything like that. But Lyra is a great character. She is an incredibly strong protagonist. She is very clever and intuitive narrative, and she's just really fun to read about, and the plot itself is also very interesting, and the themes obviously are also excellently done. The antagonists are also great, and the world building is like very obviously deep, but Pullman just sort of throws concepts at you and doesn't explain anything about what they are. So while it's obvious the world is a lot bigger than the story, you don't really fully understand it. So that's one negative I would have about it. And I would also say that the side characters, while entertaining, aren't super developed either. But yeah, I really enjoyed this and I can't wait to read the next one. I have written a full review for this book, so I'll leave that linked in the description. So after that I read a short story, which was Opal by Maggie Stiefvater, which is, I guess, supposed to bridge the gap in between the Raven Cycle and the Dreamer trilogy, and I thought it was fun. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I thought Opal herself was a really cute character. The short story really gave an insight into how her mind worked, so that was cool, and there were some really cute scenes, and there were some intriguing mysteries set up for the Dreamer trilogy, so I'm interested in seeing what that's about. After that, I read The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. So this is Erin Morgenstern's first book since The Night Circus, which I believe came out in like 2011. So it's been a long time coming. I got this Waterstone Special Edition, which is just probably one of the nicest looking books I owned. It's got this cool design on the page edges, and it has one of the nicest actual covers that I have ever seen. I'd say this is probably my best looking book overall. But that's not really relevant to what I thought of the book. I thought this was incredible. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I loved the characters, I loved the world building, I loved the interweaving of the little fairy tales into the plot. I loved that it had a lot of discussion about storytelling and stories, and I actually even loved the romance between the two main characters. Because a large part of this story is the romance, and so the main character Zachary is gay, and he falls in love with a man, but it is very insta-lovey. So that was my one major problem with the story. But once you got past the insta-love, I really enjoyed their relationship together, so it wasn't like too significant of a problem for me. But yeah, this was a wild ride. I had loads of theories, all of them were proven wrong, and I really enjoyed it. I will say that the plot did lose me somewhere in the third act, but it brought it back by the end. After The Starless Sea, I read Call Down the Hawk by Maggie Stiefvater, and this is the first book in the Dreamer trilogy, which is the sequel to the Raven Cycle. I love this book. I gave it 4.75 out of 5 stars. I really don't have many complaints about this. I thought it does a great job of expanding the world. It really explores the criminal underworld of this sort of magical society in depth, and that was really cool. You get a lot of really great characterization for Declan in this book, and he is now probably one of my favourite characters in fiction, and his relationship with another character was also like unexpectedly one of my favourites of last year. Other than that, I loved most of the new characters that were introduced. I didn't like Carmen. I already wasn't a fan of her at first, and then she does something which, in my opinion, is just completely irredeemable. So I really hate her character. I'd say my main problem with this book is that there wasn't enough of the main characters from the Raven Cycle, especially Adam and Opal. They're like really significant to Ronan, and they are barely in this book, so that was quite disappointing. But I hope that will change in future books, and I think it will. The plot itself was really intriguing and mysterious, and I can't wait to see where it goes. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of this trilogy. After that, I read Broum Binder by Alex R. Carla. So it's set on a post-apocalyptic Earth where the return of magic caused the apocalypse, basically. So now the world is overrun by necromancers and these undead creatures called Howls, who are like, they serve this godlike figure called the Dark Lady, and she is supposedly the goddess of death. And the necromancers are ruled by these Howls, who were directly created by the Dark Lady, and they're like considered her children, and they're called the Kin. And the main characters are like hunters, who are humans with magic, who are not necromancers, who are dedicated to hunting Howls and killing them, and basically just protecting humanity. And the main character is this hunter called Ten, who does this massive burst of power, and it gets him noticed by the Kin and by the leaders of the resistance. And so he's contacted by this kin called Thomas, who wants him on his side, and also a mysterious hunter called Jarrett Townsend. So I was really looking forward to this book. I thought it would be a new favourite, but I ended up only giving it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Like, don't get me wrong, it's still a good book, but it's not as great as I hoped. I really enjoyed the characters. I thought the romance between Ten and his love interest was really cute. The world building was decent, but it's sort of exposition dumped in the second part of the book, and it's not that well explained, in my opinion. And the ending is really rushed, so I didn't like that aspect of it. And also, other than that, there is some really weird phrasing choices. Like, people don't stand up, they move to standing, and like, that is technically grammatically correct, but it's really weird, and I didn't like that, and it was really distracting, and it's all throughout the story. And like, there are loads of mysteries set up in this book, and absolutely none of them get answered by the end, so that was a bit disappointing. I do plan to continue with the series, but it's not that high of a priority, and I think on reflection I would drop that 3.5 stars down to just 3. I haven't written a review for this book, but I have written a few notes that I want to turn into a review, so I'll link those in the description. So after that I read Saga Volume 2 and Volume 3 by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. Volume 2 is probably my least favourite of the series so far. I didn't find the new characters who were introduced very interesting, and I didn't like the main modern day plot of the story, to be honest. I thought it was a bit boring, really. But I did really enjoy getting to see how Marco and Alana's relationship started, so that was cool. And obviously the world designs and species designs were just as imaginative as in the previous volume. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Whereas Volume 3 is my favourite in the series so far. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. As a contrast to Volume 2, I really enjoyed every new character introduced in here. I particularly enjoyed Upshur and Doff's storyline, because it was really interesting to get to see how the Landfall authorities were dealing with the situation. Other than that, Clara and Oswald were really cute together, and I really liked their scheming wisdom. So yeah, I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I haven't written reviews for either of these, but I have written some notes that I want to turn into reviews for both of them, so I'll also leave those linked in the description. And finally, the last book I read in 2019 was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. And what a great book to end the year on. So this is a retelling of the Iliad from the point of view of Patroclus, and it focuses on the romance between him and Achilles. And this book was incredible. It was cute and sweet and fun, and it was poignant and devastating, and it sometimes made me furious, and it was great. This book also made me hate Odysseus, who is my favourite Greek hero, so that's quite a feat. But yeah, I loved this book. It's a new favourite. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So that was every single book that I read in 2019. If you've read any of these books, I'd love to hear what you thought about them, so please leave that in the comments. I realise that this doesn't exactly support my assertion that I mostly read more obscure or queer books, but I promise you that my next wrap-up will. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Follow me on Twitter or add me as a friend on Goodreads if you feel so inclined. I will hopefully have another video up soon, but until then, thank you for watching. I have been Isaac, and this has been Books with Ike. Goodbye.